Joseph Crow Feather's weathered hands stopped mid-reach for the snare wire, his breath crystallizing in the Montana air as he stared at what hung before him. Two wolf cubs dangled from fishing line like broken marionettes, their gray fur matted with ice, bodies motionless against the storm-darkened pines. They were supposed to be dead. The smaller one, storm cloud gray with patches of white, suddenly opened one amber eye and looked directly into his soul. Joe's knees buckled, sending him crashing into the snow as 3 years of buried grief erupted from his chest in a sound somewhere between a sob and a prayer. This was Marcus all over again. Another helpless life slipping away while he stood frozen, useless. "Don't you dare," he whispered to whatever force controlled life and death, his arthritic fingers already working at the cruel knots. "Don't you take these babies too." But 200 miles away, Dr. William Stark was already loading his tranquilizer gun, tracking the GPS signals he'd planted in those very cubs. The hunt was about to begin. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Blackfeet Reservation stretched endlessly under Montana's unforgiving sky, a land where ancient traditions wrestled with modern hardships like wolves fighting over the last scrap of meat. Here, among the rolling hills dotted with trailers and prefab houses, lived people who remembered when buffalo darkened the plains and wolves sang the old songs to the moon. Joseph Crow Feather had once been the reservation's head veterinarian, a man whose gentle hands could coax life back into the most broken creatures. At 72, those same hands now shook with arthritis and something deeper, the tremor of a soul that had lost too much. His weathered face, carved by decades of Montana wind and 3 years of grief, told the story of a man who had forgotten how to hope. The cabin where Joe lived alone sat like a forgotten prayer at the edge of the forest. Inside, 2 coffee cups waited on the kitchen table each morning. One for him, one for the silence his son Marcus had left behind. Marcus, 28 years old, with his father's healing touch and his grandfather's fierce love for all living things, had vanished 3 years ago while investigating reports of poisoned wildlife. The official story was an accident, a fall into the river during spring floods. Joe knew better, but knowing and proving were different beasts entirely. 6 months after Marcus disappeared, Joe's wife Elena followed their son into whatever realm holds the broken-hearted. Her funeral was the last time Joe spoke to most of his neighbors. Now he lived like a ghost in his own life, drinking away the days and talking to memories that never answered back. The medical bills from Elena's final months had devoured their savings like a prairie fire. $340,000 for treatments that bought time, but not miracles. Joe's veterinary practice, once the pride of the reservation, had closed when his hands became too unsteady and his heart too shattered to heal anything. The foreclosure notice tucked behind the sugar bowl gave him 30 days to find money he didn't have for a home that felt more like a tomb. 20 miles away, Dr. Sarah Running Bear made her rounds at the tribal health clinic, her nurse practitioner's bag heavy with more than medical supplies. It carried the weight of a community's trust. At 58, Sarah possessed the rare combination of fierce competence and infinite compassion that made her both healer and confessor to half the reservation. Her husband Tom, a park ranger, had died fighting a forest fire 5 years earlier, leaving her to raise their daughter Rebecca alone. Sarah was the only person who still checked on Joe, bringing him groceries he rarely ate and news from a world he'd stopped caring about. She'd been in love with him since they were teenagers, but some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, especially to a man whose heart had already shattered beyond repair. Neither Joe nor Sarah knew that their quiet, desperate lives were about to collide with forces darker than grief and more dangerous than poverty. forces that had been hunting on their sacred land for longer than anyone imagined. The storm had been building for 3 days, turning the world into a canvas of white fury that made even the hardiest reservation dogs seek shelter. Joe Crowfeather pulled his father's old hunting coat tighter as he trudged through knee-deep snow toward the ridge where he'd set signal traps decades ago as a young ranger. He wasn't checking them for poachers anymore. Those days were long gone. But old habits died harder than hope, and walking the trap line was the only thing that still felt like purpose. His breath came in sharp puffs that froze before they could dissipate, each step a negotiation between arthritic joints and sheer, stubborn will. The bottle of whiskey in his coat pocket knocked against his ribs with each movement, a liquid metronome keeping time with his misery. He'd promised Elena on her deathbed that he'd stop drinking, but promises to the dead were easier to break than promises to the living. The first trap was empty, as it had been for months. The second showed signs of deer passage, but nothing more. It was at the third location, near the old lightning-struck pine that Marcus had loved to climb as a boy, that Joe's world tilted off its axis. Through the swirling snow he saw them, two small forms hanging from thin wire, suspended like grotesque ornaments from a low branch. His first thought was that some sick bastard had strung up rabbits as a joke. But as he fought through the drifts toward the tree, the shapes resolved into something that made his stomach clench with rage and heartbreak. Wolf cubs. 2 of them, barely alive, their gray fur crusted with ice and their small bodies hanging limp from snares that had been designed not to kill quickly, but to torture. Professional snares, Joe realized with growing horror, the kind used by researchers who needed their subjects alive. The smaller cub, storm cloud gray with white patches on her chest and paws, hung motionless except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of her rib cage. The larger one, darker and more robust, had fought the snare until his front paws were bloody, but now he too hung still, conserving what little strength remained. Joe's hands shook as he pulled out his knife, and for a moment he wasn't sure if the tremor was from Parkinson's, the cold, or the overwhelming surge of emotion threatening to buckle his knees. These cubs couldn't be more than 3 months old, the same age Marcus had been when Joe first taught him to whistle like a meadowlark. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he whispered, the old prayer his grandmother had taught him spilling out unbidden. "What kind of monster does this to babies?" As he reached for the first snare, the smaller cub opened her eyes, amber gold like autumn leaves, and looked directly at him. In that gaze, Joe saw something that broke him completely. Trust. Despite everything that had been done to her, this little creature looked at him with the absolute faith that he would help. The snare wire was thin but strong, designed to tighten under struggle, but never quite enough to kill. Joe's fingers, stiff with cold and age, fumbled with the mechanism while his mind raced through veterinary protocols he hadn't used in years. Hypothermia, dehydration, possible internal injuries from the struggles. These cubs needed medical attention he couldn't provide in a blizzard. The larger cub stirred as Joe freed his sister, amber eyes flickering open with an alertness that surprised the old man. This one was a fighter, Joe could tell. The kind of stubborn survivor that reminded him painfully of Marcus at that age. The cub didn't struggle as Joe worked to free him, but Joe felt the young animal's muscles tense, ready to defend his sibling if necessary. When both cubs were free, Joe wrapped them in his coat, feeling their tiny hearts beating against his chest like desperate prayers. They were so light, so fragile, yet somehow their warmth seemed to kindle something in Joe's chest that had been cold for 3 years. The walk back to his cabin was a nightmare of wind and snow, each step a monumental effort as Joe fought to keep the cubs warm while navigating terrain that had become alien in the whiteout. His old bones screamed in protest, But something deeper than pain drove him forward, the same fierce protectiveness that had made him a good father and a better veterinarian. By the time he reached his cabin, Joe was exhausted and hypothermic himself, but the cubs were alive. As he shouldered through his front door into the blessed warmth of his wood stove, Joe Crow Feather made a decision that would change everything. These babies wouldn't die on his watch. Not today, not ever. He didn't know that 200 miles away, Dr. William Stark was staring at a computer screen showing 2 GPS signals that had just gone stationary at coordinates he recognized. The doctor's pale eyes glittered with something between rage and anticipation as he reached for his phone. The hunt was about to intensify. The cubs lay motionless on Marcus's old quilt, their breathing so shallow that Joe had to lean close to see the rise and fall of their small chests. He'd wrapped them in every blanket he could find, but their body temperature was dangerously low and hypothermia was claiming them despite his efforts. The larger cub, Joe had started thinking of him as Alpha, occasionally lifted his head with tremendous effort, amber eyes seeking his smaller companion before exhaustion forced him back down. Joe's veterinary training kicked in like muscle memory, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the arthritis that made every motion painful. He prepared a makeshift IV from supplies he hadn't touched in 3 years, his fingers remembering the delicate work of finding veins in creatures this small. The female cub, Luna he'd decided for the crescent-shaped marking on her forehead, didn't even flinch when the needle went in. It was past midnight when headlights swept across his windows, followed by the distinctive rumble of Sarah Running Bear's old pickup truck. Joe cursed under his breath. Sarah had a key to his cabin, a relic from the days when she'd checked on Elena during her final illness, and she wasn't shy about using it when she thought he was in trouble. "Joe?" Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with medical emergencies. "Your lights have been on all night, and Mrs. Ironcloud said she saw you walking the trap line in that storm. Are you trying to kill yourself?" The front door opened before Joe could answer, bringing a swirl of snow and the scent of Sarah's herbal shampoo. She stomped her boots on the mat, shaking ice from her long black hair that showed more silver than it had when they were young. At 58, Sarah Running Bear still moved with the confident grace that had made half the boys in their high school class fall in love with her. But her face showed the lines that came from watching too many people suffer. "Joe, I swear, if you're drunk again, I'm going to—" She stopped mid-sentence, her nurse's eyes immediately cataloging the scene. The IV set up, the medical supplies scattered across his coffee table, and 2 small forms wrapped in blankets by the fire. "Sweet Mother of God," she whispered, crossing herself the way she'd learned from the Catholic sisters at boarding school. "Joe, what have you done?" "I found them," Joe said simply, not looking up from where he was checking Luna's pulse. "Hanging in snares up on Crying Woman Ridge. Some bastard left them to die slowly." Sarah dropped her medical bag and was beside him in 2 steps, her professional training overriding everything else. Her hands moved over the cubs with the same gentle competence she brought to treating pneumonia in elders or broken bones in rodeo cowboys. Joe watched her work, remembering why he'd fallen in love with her 40 years ago. Sarah Running Bear had never met a living thing she wouldn't fight to save. "Internal temperature is too low to register," she murmured, lifting Alpha's eyelid to check his pupil response. "This one's in better shape, but the female—" She shook her head. "Joe, these animals need equipment we don't have. They need a real veterinary hospital." "Can't do it," Joe said firmly. "Soon as we report this, they'll want to know where I found them. Could be evidence in some kind of investigation. They'll take the cubs away." Sarah's dark eyes flashed with the temper that had gotten her suspended from nursing school for challenging a professor who'd made racist comments about native patients. "Joe Crow Feather, you stubborn fool. These animals will die if we don't get them proper medical attention." They'll die anyway if we turn them over to the government, Joe shot back. How many times have we seen that? We'll take good care of them, they say, and next thing you know, they're lab specimens or stuffed exhibits in some museum. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the cubs with the calculating look she got when solving complex medical puzzles. Finally, she sighed and started rolling up her sleeves. All right, but we do this my way. I've got supplies in my truck that might help, and Rebecca's coming home from college this weekend. She's been studying wildlife biology, might know something about wolf physiology we don't. Working together felt natural in a way that surprised them both. Joe's veterinary knowledge combined with Sarah's nursing skills created a partnership that had been missing from both their lives for too long. They worked in comfortable silence, communicating through glances and brief touches that carried the weight of shared history. It was Sarah who discovered the first anomaly while examining Alpha more closely. "Joe," she said quietly, her fingers probing the thick fur around the cub's neck. "There's something here." She carefully parted the fur to reveal a thin leather cord, almost invisible against the dark fur. Hanging from it was a small metal tag, the kind used by researchers to track animals. But this wasn't a standard wildlife tag. The numbers were wrong, the format unfamiliar. "GPS tracker," Sarah breathed, her face paling. "Joe, someone's been tracking these cubs. That's how they knew exactly where to set those snares." The implications hit Joe like a physical blow. The snares hadn't been random cruelty, they'd been a trap, set with scientific precision for these specific animals. Someone had been hunting Alpha and Luna with the kind of resources and knowledge that suggested government involvement or, worse. "We're in over our heads," Sarah whispered, unconsciously moving closer to Joe as if proximity could ward off the danger they'd stumbled into. "Whoever did this has serious backing. They'll come looking." Joe stared down at the two small lives they'd committed themselves to protecting, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. He'd failed to protect Marcus from whatever forces had taken his son. He wouldn't fail these innocents. "Let them come," he said quietly, his voice carrying a steel that hadn't been there since Marcus disappeared. "I've got nothing left to lose, and I'm tired of being afraid." Outside, the storm howled against the windows, but inside the small cabin, two old friends sat guard over two small miracles, neither knowing that their act of compassion had just put them in the crosshairs of something far more dangerous than the Montana wilderness. The cubs survived their first night, and with dawn came the kind of fierce determination Joe hadn't felt since the early days of searching for Marcus. Alpha had managed to lap some warm broth from a spoon, while Luna remained worryingly still but stable. Sarah had stayed through the night, catching fragments of sleep in Elena's old rocking chair, while Joe maintained his vigil by the fire. As morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, Sarah examined the GPS tracker more closely under Joe's magnifying lamp. The device was sophisticated, military-grade equipment that spoke of serious funding and federal connections. The serial numbers led to a shell company registered in Virginia, but deeper investigation would require resources they didn't have. "We need to remove these," Sarah said, testing the strength of the leather cords. "But carefully. If whoever planted them is monitoring the signals, we don't want to trigger any alarms." Joe nodded, understanding the implications. They were buying time, nothing more. Eventually, the people who owned these tracking devices would come looking, and when they did, Joe and Sarah needed to be ready with answers that wouldn't get them all killed. The transformation in both cubs over the following weeks was remarkable. Alpha proved to be intelligent beyond anything Joe had expected from such a young animal. The cub learned to open simple latches, could distinguish between different human voices from another room, and showed an uncanny ability to sense Joe's mood swings before they happened. When Joe's early-stage Alzheimer's caused confusion, forgetting where he'd put his glasses or what he'd been doing, Alpha would gently guide him to the right location or object. Luna's recovery was slower but equally miraculous. The smaller cub had sustained internal injuries that should have killed her, but she possessed a quiet resilience that reminded Joe painfully of Elena during her final illness. Luna rarely left Joe's side, sleeping curled against his legs at night and following him around the cabin during the day, with the devotion of a guardian angel. Sarah visited daily, officially to monitor the cub's medical progress, but really because the cabin had become a place of healing for all of them. She brought medical supplies, fresh food, and most importantly, conversation that pulled Joe back from the isolated darkness he'd lived in for 3 years. They talked about everything except the growing feelings between them. That subject remained too dangerous, too fragile for either to risk. It was Rebecca who first noticed they were being watched. Sarah's daughter had returned from Montana State for winter break, her wildlife biology studies making her invaluable in caring for Alpha and Luna. At 21, Rebecca possessed her mother's fierce intelligence and her father's ranger instincts, traits that served her well when she spotted the surveillance team. "Mom, there's been a black SUV parked on the access road for 3 days," Rebecca reported during one of their evening visits. "Same license plate, same driver. He's got binoculars and what looks like electronic equipment." Joe felt his blood chill. The tracking devices they'd removed from the cubs had been dead for 2 weeks, but apparently their mystery hunter had other ways of finding his quarry. "How long before they move from watching to acting?" "Not long," Sarah said grimly. "Rebecca, I want you to go back to Missoula. Stay with your roommate until this is over." "Like hell," Rebecca shot back with her mother's temperament. "These cubs need medical attention I can provide, and you two need backup more than you're willing to admit." The argument was interrupted by Alpha's sudden alertness. The young wolf's ears pricked forward, and he positioned himself between the humans and the front door, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Luna immediately moved to stand beside him, both cubs staring at the door with an intensity that made Joe's skin crawl. Car doors slammed outside, followed by the crunch of boots on snow. Multiple sets of boots, moving with military precision around the perimeter of the cabin. Joe grabbed his shotgun from above the fireplace while Sarah herded the cubs toward the back bedroom. "Mr. Crowfeather?" The voice from outside was cultured, educated, with the kind of authority that came from never being questioned. "My name is Dr. William Stark. I'm with the Federal Wildlife Research Division. I believe you have something that belongs to us." Joe approached the front window carefully, peering through a gap in the curtains. 3 men stood in his yard, all wearing identical black winter gear and carrying equipment bags that suggested they weren't planning a friendly chat. The leader was pale, perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of cold intelligence that made Joe's veteran instincts scream warnings. "Never heard of any Federal Wildlife Research Division," Joe called back, "and I don't have anything that belongs to the government." "Mr. Crowfeather, let's not make this more difficult than necessary. 2 juvenile wolves were taken from a legitimate research facility 6 weeks ago. Our tracking data indicates they're in your possession. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation for their return." Joe's grip tightened on his shotgun. The man's story had holes big enough to drive a truck through. No legitimate research facility would lose track of valuable subjects for 6 weeks without reporting it, and the snares he'd found the cubs in were designed for capture, not tracking. "What kind of research?" Joe demanded. There was a pause, and Joe caught sight of Dr. Stark speaking quietly into a radio. When the man's voice returned, it carried a harder edge. "That's classified information, Mr. Crowfeather. I'm sure you understand the importance of national security." Sarah appeared at Joe's elbow, Rebecca close behind. All three generations of defiance were represented in that moment: Joe's warrior stubbornness, Sarah's professional courage, and Rebecca's young idealism. None of them were backing down. "Show me some identification," Sarah called out, her nurse's authority lending weight to the demand. "Federal agents carry badges, not just business cards." Dr. Stark's laugh was like ice cracking. "Ms. Running Bear, I presume? Your interference in this matter has been noted. I'd hate for there to be consequences for your medical license." The threat was naked now, all pretense of cooperation abandoned. Joe felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd had the night Marcus disappeared, when official explanations hadn't matched the evidence his eyes and heart knew to be true. "Get off my land," Joe said quietly, but his voice carried through the thin cabin walls. "You've got no warrant, no authority I recognize, and no business with me or mine. Mr. Crowfeather, you're harboring federal property. That's a felony that carries serious prison time. At your age, with your medical condition, I doubt you'd survive the experience." The mention of his Alzheimer's hit Joe like a physical blow. These people had done their homework, knew details about his life that weren't public record. The implication was clear. They had resources, connections, and the willingness to use whatever leverage they could find. Behind him, Alpha whined softly, and Joe felt the young wolf press against his legs. The simple contact reminded him what this was really about: not federal property or research protocols, but two innocent lives that had already suffered too much. He thought of Marcus, of all the times he'd wished he could have protected his son from whatever forces had taken him. "I'll give you boys 1 minute to get in your vehicles and disappear," Joe said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent decades dealing with dangerous situations. "After that, I start assuming you're trespassers with hostile intent." There was movement outside, the sound of equipment being repositioned. Dr. Stark's voice, when it came again, held the kind of cold fury that suggested this confrontation was far from over. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Crowfeather. We know about your son Marcus. We know about the medical bills, the drinking, the isolation. You're not equipped to handle this situation. These animals are dangerous. They've already killed once." Joe's blood turned to ice water. The casual mention of Marcus, the implication that these people knew more about his son's disappearance than they should have. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about lost research subjects. This was personal, connected to whatever had happened to Marcus 3 years ago. "We'll be back," Dr. Stark called as the sound of retreating footsteps reached the cabin. "And next time, we won't be asking nicely." The engines started and the vehicles pulled away, but Joe knew this was just the beginning. He looked down at Alpha and Luna, both cubs watching him with eyes that held more intelligence and trust than any wild animal should possess. Whatever these cubs really were, wherever they'd come from, they were now his responsibility. Sarah's hand found his shoulder, her touch warm and steadying. "Joe, what did he mean about Marcus?" Joe met her eyes, seeing his own fears reflected there. "I don't know yet," he said quietly, "but I'm damn well going to find out." Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly under a gray sky. But Joe no longer felt isolated. He had family to protect again, a purpose that went beyond mere survival. Dr. Stark and his mysterious organization had made one crucial mistake. They'd given a broken old man something to fight for. And Joseph Crowfeather had never lost a fight that really mattered. The confrontation came sooner than expected. 3 days after Dr. Stark's visit, Joe woke to the sound of vehicles surrounding his cabin. Not the careful approach of surveillance. This was the aggressive positioning of people who'd moved beyond negotiation to enforcement. Through his bedroom window, he counted at least 6 men in tactical gear, moving with the precision that spoke of military or law enforcement training. Alpha and Luna sensed the danger immediately, both cubs pressing close to Joe as he reached for his shotgun. Their behavior had changed dramatically since Stark's visit, as if they understood that their peaceful sanctuary was under siege. Alpha's ears remained constantly alert, and Luna had taken to sleeping directly across the cabin's threshold, positioning herself to intercept any threat that might come through the door. "Joe!" Sarah's voice carried urgency as she burst through the back door, Rebecca close behind. "They've got roadblocks on both access routes. And whatever they're planning, they don't want witnesses." Joe's heart hammered as he processed the implications. Roadblocks meant official backing, or at least the appearance of it. These weren't just private contractors anymore. They had resources that suggested government involvement at some level. "Rebecca, there's a hunting trail that leads to the old mining road," Joe said quickly. "Take Luna and get out of here. Head for your grandfather's place in Browning." "I'm not leaving without—" Rebecca started, but Sarah cut her off. "Do what Joe says. These cubs need at least one of them to survive, and you're the only one young enough to outrun whatever's coming." The front door exploded inward before Rebecca could respond, torn from its hinges by some kind of battering device. Dr. Stark entered first, flanked by two men carrying tranquilizer weapons. His pale eyes swept the cabin with the cold satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "Mr. Crowfeather, you've led us quite a chase," Stark said, his voice carrying the cultured menace Joe had learned to hate. "But this ends now. Those animals are coming with us, one way or another." Alpha stepped forward, placing himself between Stark and the humans he'd adopted as family. The young wolf's lips pulled back in a snarl that would have been impressive in an adult animal, but seemed almost heartbreaking coming from a creature barely 4 months old. Luna pressed against Joe's legs, trembling not with fear, but with the same protective rage her companion displayed. "These cubs aren't going anywhere," Joe said, raising his shotgun. "I don't know what kind of sick experiments you people are running, but it stops here." Stark's laugh was like breaking glass. "Experiments? Oh, Mr. Crowfeather, you understand so little. These aren't just wolves, they're hybrids, bred specifically for their enhanced intelligence and human bonding capabilities. Do you have any idea what creatures like this are worth on the international market?" The words hit Joe like physical blows. Enhanced intelligence, human bonding capabilities. The phrases suggested genetic manipulation. Breeding programs designed to create animals with specific traits. No wonder Alpha and Luna had adapted to human companionship so quickly. They'd been designed for it. "You're talking about selling them," Sarah said, her voice tight with horror. "These are living creatures, not commodities." "These are valuable assets that represent years of research and millions of dollars in development costs," Stark replied coldly. "Assets that were stolen from our facility by someone who didn't understand their true nature." Rebecca had been edging toward the back door while Stark talked, Luna moving with her in perfect synchronization. But one of Stark's men noticed the movement and raised his tranquilizer weapon. "Doctor, the female is trying to escape." Stark's attention snapped to Rebecca and Luna, his expression shifting to something predatory and eager. "Excellent. We can test the separation anxiety protocols in real time. Shoot the girl. A leg wound should suffice to keep her stationary while we observe the animal's response." Time seemed to slow as the tranquilizer gun swiveled toward Rebecca. Joe's shotgun was already moving, but he knew he wouldn't be fast enough. Sarah was shouting something, her voice distorted by the roar of blood in Joe's ears. Alpha moved like lightning, launching himself at the gunman with a ferocity that seemed impossible for such a young animal. His jaws clamped down on the man's wrist, causing the tranquilizer dart to go wide, embedding itself in the cabin wall inches from Rebecca's head. The man screamed, more from shock than pain, and tried to shake Alpha loose. But the young wolf held on with grim determination, his enhanced intelligence apparently including an understanding of tactical advantages. By attacking the weapon hand, Alpha had neutralized the immediate threat while positioning himself for further defensive action. Stark's composure cracked for the first time, his cultured mask slipping to reveal something savage underneath. "Shoot them all!" he snarled at his remaining men. "The tranquilizers, the humans, I don't care. We only need the animals alive." Joe's shotgun boomed, the heavy shot taking out the nearest gunman and sending the others diving for cover. Sarah had produced a pistol from somewhere. Joe didn't know she carried one, but living alone on a reservation had taught many women to be prepared for trouble. In the chaos that followed, Rebecca managed to reach the back door with Luna. The young woman's biology training had taught her enough about animal behavior to understand that separating the cubs might traumatize them permanently, but keeping them both here meant certain death, or worse. "Luna, stay with Rebecca," Joe called to the small wolf, hoping the enhanced intelligence Stark had mentioned would allow her to understand the necessity of escape. "Protect each other." Luna hesitated at the threshold, amber eyes locked on Alpha, who was still engaged with the wounded gunman. For a moment Joe thought she would refuse to leave her companion. Then Rebecca whistled, a perfect imitation of the meadowlark call Joe had taught her years ago, and Luna responded, following the young woman into the Montana wilderness. Alpha released his grip on the gunman's wrist and bounded back to Joe's side, blood on his muzzle but eyes bright with fierce satisfaction. The young wolf had drawn first blood in defense of his adopted family, and Joe felt a surge of pride that mixed honor with heartbreak. "This isn't over," Stark said, dabbing at a cut on his forehead where flying debris had caught him. "You've made this personal now. And I have resources you can't imagine. I'll have those animals, and I'll have satisfaction for what you've cost me." "Get out," Joe said quietly, his shotgun trained on Stark's chest. "Take your wounded and get off my land before I decide you're not worth the ammunition." Stark's pale eyes promised future violence, but he gestured for his men to withdraw. The wounded gunman needed medical attention, and the tactical situation had shifted decisively against them. But as they prepared to leave, Stark delivered one final psychological blow. "Your son Marcus understood the value of our research," he said conversationally. "Such a pity he became so uncooperative toward the end." Joe's world tilted. The casual reference to Marcus, the implication that Stark had known his son personally, it confirmed every nightmare suspicion Joe had harbored for 3 years. Marcus hadn't died in an accident. He'd discovered something connected to these hybrid wolves and the people who created them. "What did you do to my boy?" Joe's voice was barely human, raw with 3 years of suppressed grief and growing rage. Stark smiled, the expression holding no warmth or humanity. "Ask him yourself, Mr. Crowfeather, when you see him again." The words hung in the air like a curse as Stark and his men retreated, leaving Joe and Sarah standing in the wreckage of what had been a peaceful morning. Alpha pressed against Joe's legs, offering what comfort a young wolf could provide to a man whose world had just shattered and reformed around a single impossible possibility. Marcus might be alive, and if he was, Joe would find him, no matter what it cost or who he had to go through. The old veterinarian was done being a victim of forces beyond his understanding. It was time to become a hunter himself. The next 72 hours unfolded like a nightmare painted in shades of desperation and mounting dread. Joe's cabin, once a sanctuary from the world's cruelties, had become a crime scene that no official agency seemed interested in investigating. When Sarah called the tribal police about the break-in and assault, she was told that federal jurisdiction had taken precedence. Any investigation would be handled by authorities who conveniently had no intention of returning her calls. Alpha had changed since the confrontation, his enhanced intelligence manifesting in ways that were both remarkable and heartbreaking. The young wolf seemed to understand that Luna was gone, and his grief mirrored Joe's own. Alpha would sit by the back door for hours, ears pricked toward the wilderness where his companion had vanished with Rebecca. When he wasn't maintaining his vigil, Alpha shadowed Joe with an intensity that spoke of trauma-bonded loyalty. He would not allow his remaining family member out of his sight. Joe found himself talking to Alpha in ways he'd once talked to Marcus, sharing thoughts and fears with a creature whose amber eyes held understanding that defied natural explanation. The enhanced intelligence Stark had mentioned was becoming more apparent daily. Alpha could open complex latches, seemed to comprehend human conversation beyond simple commands, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that unnerved even Sarah's scientific mind. It was on the third night after the attack that Joe's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. The combination of stress, sleep deprivation, and the constant fear for Rebecca and Luna had triggered his worst Alzheimer's episode in months. Sarah found him in the kitchen at 3 a.m. fully dressed and packing a bag while talking animatedly to someone who wasn't there. "Marcus, we need to get moving," Joe was saying, his voice carrying the urgency of a man convinced his son was standing beside him. "They're coming back, and this time they'll be ready for us. We can't let them take the cubs." Sarah's heart broke watching the proud, capable man she'd loved for decades reduced to this confusion. She approached slowly, the way she'd been trained to handle patients experiencing psychiatric episodes. Alpha was already there, pressed against Joe's legs, providing the kind of grounding presence that no human therapy could match. "Joe," Sarah said gently, "it's me. It's Sarah. You're safe." Joe turned toward her voice, his eyes struggling to focus on the present. For a moment his face showed the lost expression of someone trying to navigate between past and present, memory and reality. Then Alpha whined softly, the sound somehow cutting through the confusion to reach whatever part of Joe remained anchored to the now. "Sarah?" Joe's voice was small, uncertain. What time is it?" "It's late," she said, helping him to a chair. "You were having an episode. Do you remember what happened earlier?" The memories came flooding back. Stark's visit, the violence, Rebecca and Luna's escape into the wilderness. Joe's hands shook as the full weight of their situation settled on him again. They were isolated, outgunned, and facing an enemy with resources that seemed limitless. Worse, they had no way of knowing if Rebecca and Luna were safe or if Stark's people had already tracked them down. "I'm losing my mind," Joe said quietly, the admission carrying 3 years of accumulated fear. "What happens to Alpha when I can't remember who he is? What happens when I forget why I need to protect him?" Sarah knelt beside his chair, taking his weathered hands in hers. "Then I'll remember for both of us. We're not alone in this anymore, Joe. We're family." The word hung between them, carrying decades of unspoken feelings and the weight of current desperation. Family. Something Joe had thought lost forever when Marcus disappeared and Elena died. Something Sarah had believed beyond her reach when Tom burned to death fighting forest fires. Now, in the midst of their darkest hour, they'd found it again in the most unlikely circumstances. Alpha seemed to sense the emotional shift, moving closer to both humans as if offering his own pledge of loyalty. The young wolf's presence reminded them that family came in many forms, and that love could transcend species barriers when survival was at stake. Their moment of connection was shattered by the sound of breaking glass in the front room. Alpha was on his feet instantly, hackles raised and teeth bared, positioning himself between his humans and the source of the noise. Joe grabbed his shotgun while Sarah reached for the pistol she'd started carrying everywhere. But instead of armed intruders, they found Rebecca's face peering through the shattered window, her features tight with exhaustion, and something that might have been terror. Behind her, Luna's small form was barely visible in the darkness, the young wolf's coat matted with ice and debris from days of hard travel. "Thank God," Sarah breathed, rushing to unlock the front door. "Rebecca, what happened? Where have you been?" Rebecca practically fell through the doorway, Luna close behind. Both looked like they'd been living rough, surviving on whatever they could find in the Montana wilderness. Rebecca's expensive winter gear was torn and dirty, her face gaunt with fatigue and stress. Luna appeared healthier than her human companion, but even the young wolf showed signs of the ordeal they'd endured. "They found us," Rebecca said without preamble, accepting the hot coffee Sarah pressed into her shaking hands. "2 days ago, near Grandfather's old hunting cabin. Men with dogs, tracking equipment, the whole military operation. We barely got away." Alpha had rushed to Luna's side, the reunion between the cubs both joyful and heartbreaking. They pressed against each other, communicating in ways that transcended human understanding, sharing the trauma and relief of their separation. Joe watched them and thought of all the times he'd wished he could have one more conversation with Marcus, one more chance to say the things that mattered. "How did you evade them?" Sarah asked, her professional mind cataloging her daughter's condition for signs of serious injury or exposure. "Luna," Rebecca said simply. "She's extraordinary, Mom. I know that sounds crazy, but she seemed to know where they were before we could see or hear them. She'd lead me away from danger, find water sources, even locate food when we were desperate. It's like she understood we were being hunted and knew how to stay alive." The enhanced intelligence Stark had mentioned. Joe found himself wondering what other capabilities these hybrid wolves possessed, and what kind of research had created them. The implications were staggering. If someone could breed animals with human-level intelligence and emotional bonding, what other experiments might they be conducting? "They're not going to stop," Rebecca continued, her young face showing wisdom earned through terror. The man leading the search team, not Stark, someone else, he was talking on the radio about acceptable losses and retrieval protocols. "They're planning something bigger." Joe felt the familiar cold settle in his chest, the same intuitive dread he'd experienced the night Marcus disappeared. They were running out of time, options, and places to hide. Stark and his organization had resources that dwarfed anything a small group of reservation residents could marshal. Worse, they seemed to have official backing that made legal resistance impossible. "We need to go public," Sarah said, her voice carrying the determination that had made her one of the most respected medical professionals on the reservation. "Media attention, social media, whatever it takes to make this story too visible to cover up." Rebecca nodded eagerly. "I documented everything, the tracking devices, the surveillance, the attack on the cabin. I've got video, audio recordings, even some of the equipment they left behind. If we can get this to the right people." But Joe was shaking his head, his veteran's instincts warning him that public exposure might doom them all. "These people made Marcus disappear for 3 years without anyone asking the right questions. You think they can't do the same to us?" The truth of his words settled over them like a shroud. They were facing an enemy with the resources to manipulate official investigations, control media narratives, and eliminate threats with impunity. Going public might save the cubs, but it would almost certainly cost them their lives. Alpha and Luna had positioned themselves between the humans and the broken window, their enhanced senses alert for new threats. Joe looked at them and made a decision that would change everything. If they couldn't fight this battle with conventional weapons, maybe it was time to use unconventional ones. "No more running," he said quietly. "No more hiding. If Stark wants these cubs, he's going to have to come through all of us to get them. The revelation came 3 weeks after Rebecca's harrowing escape, delivered by an unexpected messenger who arrived at Joe's cabin like an angel of terrible knowledge. Thomas Blackhorse, a former Army Ranger who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning to work as a tribal police investigator, knocked on Joe's door at dawn carrying a manila folder that would shatter every assumption they'd made about their situation. "Joe," Thomas said without preamble, his weathered face grim with the weight of what he'd discovered. "I've been investigating Dr. Stark and his operation. What I found, it's bigger than we thought. And it's connected to Marcus." Joe's hands trembled as he accepted the folder, Alpha pressing close against his legs as if sensing the emotional earthquake about to strike. Sarah and Rebecca gathered around the kitchen table as Joe spread out photographs, documents, and surveillance reports that painted a picture of systematic corruption reaching into the highest levels of federal agencies. The first photograph showed a compound hidden deep in the Glacier National Park backcountry, its buildings disguised to look like routine forestry facilities. But the security fencing, guard towers, and restricted airspace told a different story. This was Stark's true operation, not the modest research facility he claimed, but a complex designed to house something much larger and more sinister. "Stark's been running an illegal breeding program for over a decade," Thomas explained, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a man who'd seen too much institutional betrayal. Not just wolves, bears, mountain lions, even some exotic species imported through black market channels. He's been creating hybrid animals for wealthy collectors, private militaries, and worse. Rebecca studied the aerial photographs with her biologist's eye, noting details that civilian observers might miss. "These enclosures are enormous," she said. "He'd need dozens of animals to maintain a viable breeding population. Where are they getting the genetic material?" Thomas flipped to another section of the folder, revealing shipping manifests and financial records that made Sarah gasp with horror. Zoos, wildlife refuges, even some Native American cultural sites. Anywhere animals are held in trust for public benefit, Stark's people have been infiltrating and stealing breeding stock. But it was the final set of documents that brought Joe to his knees. Medical records, experiment logs, and personnel files that included a photograph he'd thought he'd never see again. Marcus, but not as Joe remembered him. This Marcus was thin, hollow-eyed, wearing a hospital gown and restraints that spoke of long captivity. "Your son discovered the operation 3 years ago," Thomas said gently. "He was investigating reports of missing wildlife when he stumbled onto something much bigger. Stark couldn't let him go public, but Marcus was too well known to simply disappear, so they staged his death and kept him as a research subject." The words hit Joe like physical blows, each revelation worse than the last. Marcus hadn't died in an accident. He'd been kidnapped, imprisoned, subjected to whatever twisted experiments Stark and his people conducted. For 3 years, while Joe grieved and blamed himself, his son had been suffering in ways too horrible to imagine. "He's alive," Joe whispered, the words carrying equal measures of hope and agony. "My boy is alive." Sarah's medical training kicked in as she studied Marcus's photographs, noting details that painted an ominous picture. "These photos show signs of long-term pharmaceutical intervention," she said quietly. "Muscle atrophy consistent with sedation protocols, neurological indicators that suggest behavioral modification attempts. They've been using him to test their animal control methods," Thomas confirmed. "Stark's operation isn't just about breeding animals. It's about creating creatures that can be controlled absolutely. Marcus has been their human test subject for techniques they plan to use on their hybrid animals." Rebecca had gone pale, understanding the implications faster than the adults. If they've been testing control methods on a human being, then Alpha and Luna aren't just enhanced animals. They're prototypes for something much worse. Joe looked down at Alpha, who had been listening to the conversation with the uncanny attention that marked his enhanced intelligence. The young wolf's amber eyes held an awareness that was both remarkable and terrifying. If Stark's people had succeeded in creating animals that could be controlled like biological machines, then Alpha and Luna represented either the pinnacle of that achievement or its failure. "Why haven't they just taken the cubs by force?" Sarah asked. "They have resources, official backing, military equipment. What's stopping them from overwhelming us?" Thomas smiled grimly. "Because they need the cubs to come willingly. The control protocols only work if the animals maintain their emotional bonds with human handlers. Break those bonds through trauma or coercion, and the conditioning fails completely." The revelation cast their entire situation in a new light. Stark hadn't been trying to recapture escaped animals. He'd been conducting a field test, observing how Alpha and Luna responded to genuine human affection versus the artificial conditioning of his laboratory. Joe, Sarah, and Rebecca had unknowingly become part of an experiment designed to perfect techniques of psychological control. "There's more," Thomas said, his expression growing even darker. "I've been tracking federal funding for Stark's operation, following the money trail through shell companies and government contracts. The backers aren't just interested in exotic pets or security animals. They're developing biological weapons." The phrase hung in the air like a death sentence. Biological weapons, animals bred and conditioned to serve as living weapons, deployed against human targets with all the deniability that came from using natural predators. Joe thought of Alpha's intelligence, his fierce loyalty, his growing physical capabilities, and felt sick understanding what such traits could become in the wrong hands. "We have to get Marcus," Joe said, his voice carrying the steel that had made him an effective veterinarian and devoted father. "I don't care what it costs or who we have to go through. My boy is coming home." "Joe, we're talking about a fortified compound with professional security," Sarah protested. "We can't just walk in there and—" "We're not walking anywhere," Joe interrupted. "We're thinking like the animals Stark created. Alpha and Luna know that compound. They were born there, lived there until someone helped them escape. They know the layout, the security patterns, maybe even where Marcus is being held." Rebecca stared at her grandfather figure with growing understanding. "You want to use Alpha and Luna to infiltrate the compound. Let them guide a rescue mission." "It's insane," Thomas said flatly. "Even if the cubs could navigate the facility, we'd still need to get past security, locate Marcus, and extract him without triggering a massive response. The odds are astronomical." Joe knelt beside Alpha, looking into the young wolf's intelligent eyes. For a moment he could swear he saw understanding there, not just of words but of concepts, emotions, the complex web of human relationships that bound families together across time and loss. "Alpha," Joe said quietly, "do you remember the place where you were born? Do you remember the man they've been hurting?" Alpha tilted his head, a gesture so human-like that it sent chills down everyone's spine. Then the young wolf moved to the window, looking out toward the mountains where Stark's compound lay hidden among the peaks. His posture was alert, focused, as if he were already planning the route home. Luna joined her companion at the window, both cubs suddenly exhibiting behavior that transcended normal animal responses. They were communicating in ways that human observation couldn't fully comprehend, sharing information and making decisions with the kind of complex reasoning that should have been impossible for creatures their age. "They understand," Rebecca breathed. "They actually understand what we're talking about." The implications were staggering, but Joe found himself beyond surprise. After weeks of observing Alpha and Luna's capabilities, he was ready to accept that Stark's experiments had created something unprecedented. Animals with near-human intelligence, but without human moral limitations. If those traits could be harnessed for rescue rather than destruction, they might be the key to saving Marcus. "We'll need equipment, transportation, and a plan that accounts for heavy security, Thomas said, his military training taking over despite his reservations. But if we're really doing this, we'll need to move fast. My investigation has attracted attention from Stark's people. They know someone's been digging into their operation. Sarah was studying the compound photographs with her nurse's analytical mind, looking for medical facilities where Marcus might be held. Here, she said, pointing to a building set apart from the main research complex. Isolated, heavily secured with what looks like specialized medical equipment visible through the windows, that's where they'd keep long-term test subjects. Joe felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. His son was in that building, had been imprisoned there for 3 years while Joe mourned him as dead. The knowledge was both devastating and energizing. For the first time since Marcus's disappearance, Joe had a clear target for his grief and rage. "When do we leave?" he asked simply. Thomas checked his watch, calculating distances and timing. "Tonight, under cover of darkness, when their security shifts change, we'll have maybe a 4-hour window before they realize something's wrong." Joe nodded, understanding that this might be their only chance. If they failed, Marcus would disappear forever, and Alpha and Luna would be condemned to lives as biological weapons in service to whoever had funded Stark's monstrous research. But as he looked at the 2 cubs watching the mountains with unwavering focus, Joe felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. They were going to bring Marcus home or die trying, and for the first time since that terrible night when his son vanished, those felt like acceptable odds. 1 year later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the expanded cabin that had become home to an unlikely family. Joe Crowfeather sat at his kitchen table, no longer setting out 2 coffee cups, but 4, one for himself, one for Sarah, one for Marcus, and one for Rebecca, who had transferred to the University of Montana to be closer to the family she'd helped save. Marcus sat in his wheelchair by the large window they'd installed during the renovation, watching Alpha and Luna play with their 3 cubs in the yard outside. The months of captivity had taken their toll. Marcus would never walk again, and the psychological scars from Stark's experiments ran deep. But his mind was clear, his spirit slowly healing under the patient care of people who loved him unconditionally. "The Morning News wants to do a follow-up story," Sarah said, hanging up the phone with the satisfied expression she wore when dealing with bureaucrats. "Something about the 1-year anniversary of the Glacier Compound incident and how it changed federal wildlife protection laws?" Joe chuckled, remembering how the media had sanitized their desperate rescue mission into something resembling official heroism. The truth was more complex and far more dangerous than any news story could convey. Thomas Blackhorse's investigation had ultimately exposed a network of corruption that reached into multiple federal agencies, leading to congressional hearings and the complete restructuring of wildlife research oversight. Dr. William Stark was serving multiple life sentences in federal prison, his illegal breeding operation shut down, and his remaining animals relocated to legitimate sanctuaries. The compound in Glacier had been demolished, its horrific laboratories erased as if they had never existed. But for Joe's family, the healing had just begun. "How are you feeling about the interview?" Marcus asked, his voice still carrying traces of the careful control he'd learned during captivity. "They're going to ask about the cubs again." Alpha and Luna had become something of a sensation in the years since their rescue, their remarkable intelligence and human bonding documented by researchers from universities across the country. But the family had been careful to control access, protecting the cubs from becoming research subjects again, while allowing enough scientific study to advance legitimate animal psychology research. "Let them ask," Joe said, with the quiet confidence that had replaced his earlier desperation. "Alpha and Luna choose who they trust. No one forces anything on them anymore." The cubs had indeed chosen, forming bonds not just with their human family, but with the community that had rallied around their story. The Crow-Feather Wolf Sanctuary, built with donations from around the world, had become a model for ethical animal research and rehabilitation. Visitors came from every continent to observe the miraculous relationship between humans and wolves that had captured global imagination. Rebecca entered from the medical wing they'd added to accommodate Marcus's needs, carrying a tablet displaying the morning's data from the sanctuary's research programs. At 22, she had become one of the youngest published researchers in animal psychology, her work with Alpha and Luna opening new frontiers in understanding interspecies communication. The university wants to fund a 10-year longitudinal study, she reported, settling into her chair with the comfortable efficiency of someone who belonged completely in this space. Full funding, complete autonomy over research protocols, and guaranteed protection for all our animals. Joe looked around the table at his reconstructed family. Sarah, whose love had finally found its voice. Marcus, whose courage had survived unimaginable trials. Rebecca, whose scientific passion was matched by fierce protective instincts. And beyond the window, Alpha and Luna, whose trust had transformed them all. The path to this moment had been carved from grief, desperation, and the kind of love that refuses to accept loss as final. Joe thought of Elena, wondered if she could see how their family had grown beyond the boundaries of blood and species to include souls that had chosen each other through the darkest of circumstances. "Accept the funding," he said simply, "but we do it our way. No one gets to treat our family like laboratory specimens ever again." Sarah reached across the table to take his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Their wedding 6 months ago had been a small affair, witnessed by tribal elders, close friends, and 2 wolves who had seemed to understand the significance of the ceremony. Love, it turned out, was patient enough to wait 40 years for the right moment. Marcus wheeled his chair closer to the window, watching as Alpha demonstrated some complex behavior to his cubs, while Luna maintained careful watch over the entire pack. The young wolves, now approaching their first birthday, showed the same enhanced intelligence as their parents, but without the trauma of laboratory conditioning. They were what Alpha and Luna might have been if allowed to develop naturally within a loving family structure. "Sometimes I dream about the compound," Marcus said quietly, his words carrying the weight of processing trauma that would take years to fully heal. "But then I wake up here, and I remember that Stark failed. He wanted to create controlled animals, biological weapons. Instead, he gave us family members who chose love over conditioning." The insight was profound in its simplicity. Stark's experiments had indeed created something unprecedented, animals capable of complex emotional relationships with humans. But by trying to weaponize that capacity, he had missed its true significance. Alpha and Luna represented not the future of biological warfare, but the possibility of genuine partnership between species based on mutual respect and affection. Thomas Blackhorse's truck pulled into the driveway, the tribal police investigator arriving for their weekly security briefing. Even with Stark in prison and his network dismantled, they maintained careful vigilance. The research that had created Alpha and Luna was too valuable and too dangerous to assume it had died with one man's operation. "Any new threats?" Joe asked as Thomas joined them at the table. "Nothing immediate," Thomas replied, accepting the coffee Sarah poured for him. "But there's increased interest from overseas. Several governments have been asking questions about the Montana wolves through diplomatic channels. So far, the State Department is holding firm on our protection status." Joe nodded, understanding that their peace was fragile and required constant defense. But as he looked out at Alpha and Luna playing with their cubs, he felt something that had been missing from his life for too long: hope for the future. grounded in the absolute certainty that love was stronger than any force that might threaten his family. The sanctuary's morning tour would begin soon, bringing visitors from around the world to witness the miracle of trust between species. Joe would tell their story again, carefully editing out the darkest details while preserving the essential truth. Sometimes, salvation comes in forms we don't recognize, from souls we didn't know we needed. Outside, Alpha howled, not the mournful cry of a captive animal, but the joyful song of a creature who had found his pack, his purpose, his home. Luna and their cubs joined the chorus, their voices rising toward the Montana sky in a harmony that spoke of healing, hope, and the unbreakable bonds that define true family. In that moment, Joseph Crow Feather understood that his journey through grief and loss had led him exactly where he needed to be, surrounded by love that transcended every boundary except the one that mattered most, the choice to care for each other, no matter what form that caring might take. Sometimes life strips everything away, our children, our spouses, our purpose, leaving us wondering if we'll ever feel whole again. Joseph Crow Feather thought his story ended when Marcus disappeared and Elena's heart gave out from grief. At 72, living alone with nothing but medical bills and whiskey for company, Joe had accepted that happiness was for other people, younger people, people who hadn't lost everything that mattered. But then, two broken wolf cubs changed everything. In saving them, Joe discovered that family isn't just blood. It's the souls who choose to stay when the world falls apart. Sarah had loved him for 40 years in silence, waiting for his heart to heal enough to accept her devotion. Marcus survived 3 years of unimaginable captivity because he knew his father would never stop looking. Rebecca found her calling caring for creatures others had written off as lost causes. Alpha and Luna proved that trust can bloom even after trauma, that love transcends species when it's genuine and patient. Joe learned the most important truth of his golden years. It's never too late to build a new family, find a new purpose, or discover that your greatest chapter might be the one you never saw coming. What loss taught you the most about love's true power? Have you found unexpected family in the most unlikely places? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how life surprised you with second chances.